The old farmhouse kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and impending doom. Jasmine Martinez wiped flour from her hands with a dish towel that had seen better decades, watching her father Robert stare at the stack of overdue bills spread across their worn wooden table like tarot cards predicting financial disaster. "Sweet pea, how much we got left in the emergency jar?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Jasmine reached up to the ceramic rooster cookie jar on top of the refrigerator, their emergency fund that had been getting lighter every month. She counted the crumpled bills twice, hoping math had somehow changed overnight. $43.16, Dad. Robert's shoulders sagged like a scarecrow in a thunderstorm. Lord help us. That won't even cover the electricity bill, much less the mortgage payment that's due next week. From his favorite rocking chair by the window, 75-year-old Grandpa Ted looked up from whittling a piece of oak, his weathered hands still steady despite his age. His bright blue eyes, the same ones Jasmine had inherited, sparkled with the kind of mischief that had gotten him kicked out of 3 different churches for creative interpretations of Sunday service. "Well, hell's bells," Ted drawled, his Texas accent thick as molasses on a winter morning. "Sounds to me like we're broker than a busted fiddle at a square dance." "Grandpa," Jasmine scolded, though she couldn't help smiling. "Language! Honey child, when you're my age, you earn the right to call a spade and broke-ass broke." He set down his whittling and fixed his son with a stare that could have stopped a charging bull. "Now, Robert, what exactly are we going to do about this mess?" Robert shuffled through the bills like he was hoping one might magically transform into a winning lottery ticket. There might be a solution. The way he said it made Jasmine's stomach drop faster than a lead balloon. "Dad, that tone of voice usually means trouble. Remember that businessman from Dallas? The one who came by last month asking about the property?" Ted's rocking chair stopped mid-creak. "You mean that slick-talking city boy in the fancy suit? The one who looked like he'd never seen a cow up close in his natural-born life?" "Alexander Ashford," Robert nodded. "Turns out he's not just any businessman. He's got more money than sense, apparently." "And?" Jasmine prompted, though every instinct she had was screaming that she didn't want to hear the answer. Robert took a deep breath. "He's made us an offer." "What kind of offer?" Ted's voice had gone dangerously quiet, like the calm before a tornado. "The kind that would save the farm. And our bacon." Robert couldn't meet their eyes. "He wants to marry Jasmine." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with Ted's whittling knife. Even the chickens outside seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and stopped their clucking. Jasmine felt like she'd been smacked upside the head with a 2x4. "Excuse me, what now?" "Now hold on just one cotton-picking minute." Ted shot up from his rocking chair with the energy of a man half his age. "Are you telling me some fancy-pants city slicker wants to buy my granddaughter like she's a prize heifer at the county fair?" "It's not buying, Dad. It's more like a business arrangement." "Business arrangement?" Jasmine's voice climbed higher than a cat stuck in a tree. "I'm not a business, Dad. I'm a person with feelings and dreams and a very strong opinion about not being sold off to strangers." Ted started pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor, his boots making angry clicking sounds against the worn linoleum. "This is the dadgum stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I once watched you try to milk a bull because you thought it was just a funny-looking cow." "That was one time," Robert protested. "Once was enough to prove my point about your judgment," Ted shot back. Jasmine sank into one of their mismatched kitchen chairs, her head spinning like a carnival ride. "So let me get this straight. We're so broke that I have to marry some random millionaire just to keep from losing Grandpa's farm." "Billionaire, actually," Robert corrected weakly. "Oh, well, that makes it so much better." Jasmine threw her hands up in exasperation. "At least I'm being sold to premium crazy instead of bargain basement crazy." Ted stopped pacing and fixed his son with a look that could have melted steel. "Robert Martinez, you listen to me good. I've lived on this land for 75 years. I was born in that bedroom upstairs. I learned to walk on these floors, and I'll be damned if I let some smooth-talking city boy waltz in here and claim my granddaughter like she's part of the livestock." "But Grandpa," Jasmine said softly, "if we lose the farm..." "Then we lose the farm," Ted declared with the passion of a preacher at a revival meeting. "But we don't lose our dignity, and we sure as shootin' don't lose each other." Just then, They heard the rumble of an expensive engine coming up their dirt driveway. Through the kitchen window, they could see a sleek black Mercedes navigating the potholes with the careful precision of someone who clearly didn't want to get their fancy car dirty. "Well, butter my biscuit," Ted muttered, his eyes gleaming with sudden interest. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor." The car came to a stop near their front porch, and out stepped a man in a suit that probably cost more than their last 3 mortgage payments combined. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had never seen an honest day's work, and walked with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no in his entire privileged life. "That's got to be Ashford's lawyer," Robert said, straightening his flannel shirt like it might somehow transform into designer wear. "Lawyer?" Ted's grin turned absolutely wicked. Well, this just got interesting." The man knocked on their front door with the kind of polite but insistent rap that suggested he was used to being answered immediately. Robert started toward the door, but Ted held up a hand. "Now hold on there, son. Let me get that." Ted's voice carried the sweetness of honey mixed with just a hint of something that might bite you if you weren't careful. After all, hospitality is a Southern virtue. Jasmine watched her grandfather head for the front door and felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. When Grandpa Ted got that particular look in his eyes, things were about to get very interesting, very quickly. Ted opened the door with a smile that could have charmed the devil himself. "Well, hello there, stranger. What brings you to our little slice of paradise?" The lawyer, tall, thin, and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, straightened his expensive tie. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard Pemberton, legal counsel for Mr. Alexander Ashford. I believe we have an appointment?" "Course you do. Come on in, Mr. Pemberton. Don't mind the mess. We're just simple country folk." Ted gestured grandly toward the living room. "Can I get you something to drink? Sweet tea? Lemonade? Coffee that could wake the dead?" "Coffee would be adequate," Pemberton replied, stepping carefully into the house like he was afraid the floor might not hold his weight. What Pemberton didn't know, what nobody except Ted knew, was that their simple country home was about to become the most entertaining obstacle course this side of a military training facility. Ted had spent the morning preparing for exactly this moment. The loose floorboard by the couch that would creak ominously when stepped on. The strategically placed throw rug that tended to slip at the most inconvenient moments. And most importantly, their rooster Napoleon, who had developed an inexplicable hatred for anyone wearing a tie. "Right this way, Mr. Pemberton," Ted said cheerfully, leading the lawyer toward the living room. "Mind that step there. We've been meaning to fix that loose board for, about 15 years now." Sure enough, Pemberton's expensive Italian leather shoe hit the board at exactly the wrong angle, creating a groan that sounded like the house was about to collapse. The lawyer stumbled slightly, catching himself on the doorframe with the kind of undignified scrambling that suggested he rarely found himself in situations requiring actual physical coordination. "Whoops," Ted exclaimed with completely fake concern. "Sorry about that. These old houses have character, you know. Sometimes a little too much character." Pemberton straightened his tie again, trying to regain his professional composure. "Quite all right. Old houses can be charming." "Oh, this place is full of charm," Ted agreed, leading him toward the couch. "Been in our family for 3 generations. Every creaky board tells a story." As Pemberton moved to sit down, Ted casually mentioned, "Oh, you might want to avoid that cushion on the left there. Our cat Whiskers likes to use it as his personal scratching post, and the stuffing has a tendency to, well, let's just say it gets everywhere." Pemberton glanced nervously at the indicated cushion and chose the middle of the couch instead, setting his briefcase carefully on the coffee table that Ted had deliberately left slightly wobbly that morning. From the kitchen came the sound of Jasmine trying very hard not to laugh, followed by Robert's stern whisper of, "Dad, behave yourself." "So, Mr. Pemberton," Ted said, settling into his rocking chair with the air of a man getting comfortable for a long, entertaining conversation. "I hear you've got some paperwork for us to look at." Pemberton opened his briefcase with the precision of a surgeon, revealing neat stacks of legal documents that probably contained more fine print than the Constitution. "Yes, Mr. Martinez has already reviewed the preliminary terms of Mr. Ashford's proposal. This is the official contract." "Proposal?" Ted's voice carried just the right note of innocent curiosity. "What kind of proposal would that be?" Pemberton blinked, clearly not expecting to have to explain the situation from scratch. The matrimonial arrangement between Mr. Ashford and Miss Martinez. Matrimonial arrangement? Ted repeated the words like he was tasting something unfamiliar. That sounds awfully fancy. In my day, we just called it getting hitched. Yes, well, Pemberton was beginning to look like a man who regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment. Mr. Ashford prefers to approach these matters with appropriate legal formality. Oh, I bet he does. Ted nodded sagely. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, you ever been married yourself? Well, that's rather personal. Course it is. But see, here's the thing about marriage. It ain't really about contracts and legal formalities. It's about love, commitment, shared dreams, and knowing that the person you're with would stick by you even if you lost everything tomorrow. Pemberton was starting to look like a deer caught in headlights. Mr. Ashford's intentions are entirely honorable, I assure you. Oh, I'm sure they are, Ted agreed cheerfully. But tell me, has this Mr. Ashford ever actually met my granddaughter? I mean, really met her? Sat down for a proper conversation? Learned about her hopes and dreams and what makes her laugh? From the kitchen came the sound of Robert clearing his throat meaningfully, but Ted was just getting warmed up. Because you see, Mr. Pemberton, Jasmine isn't just any girl. She's special. She can make biscuits that would make angels weep. She knows every bird call in 3 counties, and she's got a heart bigger than Texas. Any man who wants to marry her better be prepared to prove he's worthy of that kind of treasure. Pemberton was now actively sweating despite the fact that it wasn't particularly warm in the house. I'm sure Mr. Ashford recognizes Miss Martinez's qualities. Qualities? Ted's eyebrows shot up like he'd just heard something scandalous. Son, she's not a horse you're buying at auction. At that precise moment, as if summoned by the universe's sense of cosmic humor, Napoleon the rooster came strutting through the living room with the confidence of a fowl who owned the place. The bird took one look at Pemberton's perfectly knotted tie and apparently decided it was a personal insult to roosters everywhere. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Napoleon announced, launching himself directly at the lawyer's chest with the enthusiasm of a feathered missile. Pemberton let out a shriek that probably scared every animal within a 5-mile radius and fell backward on the couch, briefcase flying open and sending legal documents everywhere like confetti at the world's most expensive wedding. "Napoleon, down, boy!" Ted called out, making absolutely no move to actually stop the rooster, who was now perched on Pemberton's chest like a feathered conqueror claiming his territory. "Get it off! Get it off!" Pemberton flailed helplessly, his expensive suit now decorated with rooster feathers and what might have been traces of the chicken coop. Ted finally stood up, moving with the casual speed of someone who might take his time about rooster removal. "Come on, Napoleon. That's no way to treat a guest." He gently coaxed the rooster away from the traumatized lawyer, who immediately scrambled to the far end of the couch, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. "Sorry about that," Ted said, with completely unconvincing sincerity. "Napoleon's very protective of the family. He's got excellent judgment when it comes to people's character." Pemberton straightened his tie with shaking hands and tried to gather the scattered legal documents, half of which were now on the floor and one of which appeared to have a small tear from Napoleon's beak. "Perhaps," Pemberton said weakly, "we could proceed with the contract signing?" "Course we can," Ted agreed cheerfully. "But first, let me get you that coffee I promised. You look like you could use some caffeine." As Ted headed toward the kitchen, he called back over his shoulder, "Hope you don't mind it strong. We make it the way my daddy taught me. Strong enough to wake the dead and twice as dark as midnight." What Pemberton couldn't see was Ted's absolutely wicked grin, or the fact that the coffee pot contained Ted's special guest blend, regular coffee mixed with just enough decaf to make it taste slightly off, plus a generous helping of chicory that would give it a bitter bite that would make the poor lawyer's day even more memorable. From the kitchen, Jasmine whispered, "Grandpa, you're terrible." "Terrible?" Ted whispered back, his eyes twinkling with pure mischief. "Honey child, I haven't even gotten started yet. That city boy thinks he can just waltz in here with his fancy papers and claim my granddaughter. He's about to learn that nobody, and I mean nobody, messes with the Martinez family without going through me first." And as Ted poured the coffee into their best, slightly chipped china cups, he was already planning his next move. Because if some billionaire thought he could buy his way into their family with a stack of legal papers and a fancy lawyer, he was about to discover that Grandpa Ted Martinez didn't go down without a fight. and he definitely didn't fight fair. The real question wasn't whether Ted could make things difficult for Mr. Pemberton and his client. The question was whether they'd survive long enough to make it to the actual wedding. 3 days after the Great Rooster Attack of Tuesday, as it would forever be known in Martinez family history, their dirt road was once again graced by the presence of expensive German engineering. But this time it wasn't just one sleek car. It was a whole convoy of black SUVs that looked like they belonged in a presidential motorcade rather than on a farm road that hadn't seen proper maintenance since the Clinton administration. Jasmine watched from the kitchen window as the vehicles navigated the potholes with the careful precision of someone who clearly valued their suspension more than their dignity. She was elbow-deep in bread dough, stress-baking her way through what felt like the worst week of her 24-year life. "Holy moly," she muttered, flour dusting her cheek. "Looks like the circus is coming to town." From his strategic position in his rocking chair, which he'd moved to the front porch for optimal reconnaissance purposes, Grandpa Ted was putting the finishing touches on what appeared to be a bear trap. Not an actual bear trap, mind you, but something infinitely more creative. A contraption involving fishing line, a bucket of farm-fresh manure, and a pulley system that would have made Rube Goldberg weep with pride. "Dad!" Robert called from inside the house, where he was frantically trying to make their humble farmhouse look presentable for a man who probably owned more square footage and bathrooms than they had in their entire home. "Please tell me you're not planning anything creative." "Creative?" Ted called back innocently, adjusting what appeared to be a tripwire near the front steps. "Son, I'm just doing a little maintenance work. Can't have our guests tripping over anything dangerous now, can we?" The lead SUV came to a stop, and out stepped Alexander Ashford himself, looking like he'd been photoshopped directly from the cover of Forbes magazine. Even on a farm in the middle of nowhere, the man managed to look like he was posing for a cologne advertisement. His perfectly styled dark hair didn't have a strand out of place despite the Texas wind, and his casual Friday outfit probably cost more than most people's cars. Behind him emerged what could only be described as an entourage. 2 bodyguards who looked like they could bench press a tractor, a personal assistant clutching a tablet like her life depended on it, and what appeared to be a photographer because apparently even visiting a farm required professional documentation. "Well, I'll be dipped in honey and rolled in feathers," Ted murmured to himself, watching the procession with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. Boy brought his own circus. Alexander surveyed the farmhouse with the kind of polite smile that suggested he was mentally calculating property values and finding them wanting. His gaze swept over the peeling paint on the shutters, the slightly sagging front porch, and the chicken coop that Napoleon ruled with an iron wing. "Charming," he said to his assistant, in a tone that suggested charm was not exactly what he was feeling. "Very authentic." The assistant, a sharp-faced woman who looked like she'd never seen anything more rural than Central Park, made notes on her tablet. "Shall I have the advanced team assess structural integrity, Mr. Ashford?" "That won't be necessary, Miranda," Alexander replied, straightening his designer polo shirt. "I'm sure everything is adequate." From his position on the porch, Ted cleared his throat with the kind of theatrical emphasis that suggested the show was about to begin. "Well, well, well," Ted called out cheerfully, standing up with just enough creaking of old joints to remind everyone that he was a harmless old farmer. "If it isn't Mr. Moneybags himself, welcome to our humble little spread." Alexander approached the porch with the confident stride of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with enough zeros on a check. "Mr. Martinez, I presume?" "Alexander Ashford. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Course. Ted beamed like a proud grandfather showing off his prize-winning pumpkins. "Any friend of my granddaughter's is a friend of mine. Come on up and make yourself comfortable." What Alexander didn't know, what his expensive education and business acumen couldn't possibly prepare him for, was that Grandpa Ted had spent the last 3 days turning their front porch into what could charitably be called an interactive experience. Alexander stepped confidently onto the first porch step, which immediately let out a groan that sounded like a dying elephant. The second step was worse. It actually sagged visibly under his weight, causing him to grab the railing for support. "Oops!" Ted exclaimed with completely fake concern. "Sorry about that. Been meaning to fix those steps for, about a decade now. We're used to them, but visitors sometimes find them a little challenging. Alexander managed to make it to the porch proper, though his confidence had taken a hit along with his dignity. Perhaps you should consider some renovations. Oh, we will. Soon as we get some extra cash lying around, Ted agreed cheerfully. Course, that might be a while. But hey, character, right? These old places got character coming out their ears. The photographer stepped forward, raising his expensive camera. Mr. Ashford, shall I get some shots of you with the rustic architecture? That might not be, Alexander began, but Ted was already moving into action. Photos! What a wonderful idea! Ted clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been offered free pie. You know what would make a great picture? You standing right there by that post? Ted gestured to a specific spot on the porch that looked perfectly innocent, but was actually positioned directly under his bucket contraption. Alexander, still trying to maintain his public image, moved obligingly into position. Perfect, the photographer said, adjusting his lens. Just look naturally confident, Mr. Ashford. At that exact moment, Ted, accidentally, bumped into the carefully positioned fishing line. What happened next could only be described as a masterpiece of farm-based slapstick comedy. The bucket tipped, releasing approximately 3 gallons of what Napoleon had contributed to the farm's natural fertilizer collection over the past week. The pulley system worked exactly as designed, creating a beautiful arc of organic matter that splashed down like the world's most unwelcome shower. Alexander's expensive polo shirt, designer jeans, and Italian leather shoes were suddenly decorated with what could politely be called eau de barnyard. The silence that followed was so profound that even the chickens stopped clucking to see what had happened. Oh, for crying out loud, Ted exclaimed, his Oscar-worthy performance of shock and dismay fooling absolutely no one who knew him well. I am so sorry. That dang bucket's been loose all week. I kept meaning to fix it. Alexander stood frozen in place, looking like a statue dedicated to the concept of expensive regret. His entourage stared in horror, the photographer's camera hanging forgotten in his hands, and the assistant was frantically making notes that probably involved words like biohazard and lawsuit. From inside the house came the unmistakable sound of Jasmine trying very hard not to laugh herself into a coma. Sir, one of the bodyguards stepped forward, looking like he was ready to arrest the bucket for assault. Are you injured? Alexander finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. I'm fine. Just surprised. Course you are. Ted was already moving toward the house. Let me get you some towels, and maybe some of my special soap. It's great for getting out. Well, everything really. As Ted bustled inside, he called back over his shoulder. Why don't you folks come in and get cleaned up? Jasmine's got fresh coffee brewing, and I think we even got some store-bought cookies around here somewhere. Alexander's assistant leaned close to him and whispered urgently, Sir, perhaps we should reschedule. You could return to the hotel and— No, Alexander said firmly, his jaw setting with the kind of determination that had probably built his business empire. This is just a minor setback. I didn't get where I am by running away from a little inconvenience. What Alexander couldn't see was Ted watching through the kitchen window, his eyes twinkling with absolute delight. Phase 1 of Operation Save Jasmine was complete, and the billionaire was already covered in farm aromatics. This was going even better than the time he'd convinced the church ladies that the new pastor was secretly a professional wrestler. Inside the house, Jasmine was trying to compose herself while setting out their best mismatched coffee cups. Grandpa, she whispered when Ted came in for towels. That was absolutely terrible. Terrible? Ted grinned like a cat who'd just discovered a mouse convention. Honey, child, that was beautiful. Did you see his face? Looked like he'd been struck by lightning. You can't keep doing this. The poor man is trying to be nice. Nice? Ted snorted. Sweet pea, that man brought photographers to document his visit to our home like he's some kind of celebrity. He's not being nice. He's putting on a show. Through the window, they watched Alexander attempting to clean himself off with expensive wet wipes that his assistant had produced from what appeared to be a mobile office supply store. The man was persistent. She had to give him that. Besides, Ted continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, any man who wants to marry my granddaughter, without so much as asking her opinion about it, needs to prove he's got the backbone to handle what life throws at him. And if he can't handle a little farm-fresh reality, How's he going to handle being part of this family? Jasmine looked out at Alexander, who was now determinedly walking toward their front door, despite still smelling like a barnyard after a heavy rain. Despite everything, there was something almost admirable about his refusal to give up. He's still coming in, she observed. Course he is. Ted nodded approvingly. Boy's got grit. I'll give him that. Stupid, expensive grit, but grit nonetheless. Alexander knocked on their front door with the kind of polite persistence that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted, even when covered in farm byproducts. Robert answered the door, took one look at Alexander's condition, and somehow managed to keep a straight face. Mr. Ashford, please come in. I'm so sorry about, well, everything. Think nothing of it, Alexander replied with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested he was thinking quite a lot about it indeed. Accidents happen. As he stepped into their living room, leaving a faint, aromatic trail behind him, Alexander's gaze found Jasmine standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Despite everything that had just happened, despite being covered in farm-fresh humiliation, his eyes lit up with genuine interest. Miss Martinez, he said, attempting something that might have been a charming smile if not for the piece of straw stuck in his hair. It's a pleasure to finally meet you properly. Jasmine found herself studying this strange man who'd just been doused in chicken manure and was still trying to make polite conversation. There was something almost endearing about his determination to maintain his dignity in the face of complete and utter barnyard defeat. Mr. Ashford, she replied, offering him a towel. You look like you've had quite an adventure. Adventures are good for the soul, Alexander said, accepting the towel gratefully. Though I admit this wasn't exactly what I was expecting when I woke up this morning. From his position by the window, Ted was already eyeing the loose floorboard by the couch and wondering if Alexander would manage to find it on his own or if it would need a little encouragement. So, Alexander continued, dabbing at his shirt with hopeful futility, your grandfather tells me you make excellent coffee. She does, Ted piped up cheerfully. Best coffee this side of the Mississippi. Course, you might want to sit down while you drink it. These old floors can be a little unpredictable. And as Alexander moved toward the couch, completely unaware that his day was about to get even more interesting, Ted settled back in his rocking chair with the satisfied expression of a man who was just getting warmed up. Because if Alexander Ashford thought a little farm-fresh humiliation was going to be the worst part of his day, he clearly didn't understand that Grandpa Ted Martinez was a man with a mission, unlimited creativity, and absolutely no intention of making things easy for any city slicker who thought he could just buy his way into their family. The question wasn't whether Alexander would survive the rest of his visit. The question was whether he'd have any dignity left by the time he made it back to his fancy SUV. 2 weeks had passed since the great manure incident, and somehow, much to Grandpa Ted's bewilderment and grudging respect, Alexander Ashford kept coming back. Not just once or twice, but every single day, like a well-dressed glutton for punishment who apparently enjoyed being the target of increasingly creative farm-based humiliation. Tuesday had brought the accidental collision with the sprinkler system that left him soaked and smelling like wet hay. Wednesday featured an unfortunate encounter with Bessie the pig, who had somehow escaped her pen just as Alexander was taking an important business call. Thursday introduced him to the joys of electric fence maintenance, from the wrong side of the fence. And yet, here he was on Friday evening, standing in their kitchen wearing what appeared to be his 15th expensive outfit this week, helping Jasmine peel potatoes like he'd been born to farm life instead of boardroom life. You know, Jasmine said, glancing sideways at this strange man who kept showing up despite being treated like a crash test dummy for rural living. Most people would have given up by now. Alexander looked up from the potato he was massacring with what could charitably be called enthusiasm rather than skill. Most people don't know what they want badly enough to fight for it. And you think you know what you want? I'm beginning to, he said, and something in his voice made Jasmine pause mid-peel. From his strategic position at the kitchen table, where he was supposedly reading the newspaper but actually plotting his next move, Ted peered over his reading glasses with the expression of a general whose enemy had just done something unexpectedly intelligent. The boy was learning, adapting. Yesterday, when Ted had accidentally left a rake positioned exactly where Alexander would step on it cartoon style, the billionaire had actually spotted it and stepped around it with a knowing smile. This was becoming a problem. "Jasmine, sweet pea," Ted called out, folding his newspaper with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd just made an important decision. "Why don't you show Alexander around the property while I finish up dinner preparations?" Jasmine blinked in surprise. "You're cooking dinner? Since when do you cook dinner?" "Since I decided our guest deserves the full Martinez family experience," Ted replied with a grin that would have made the Cheshire Cat nervous. "Y'all take your time. I'll have everything ready in about an hour." What Ted didn't mention was that his version of dinner preparation involved several items that weren't typically found in most cookbook recipes. Super glue, fishing line, a strategically placed whoopee cushion from his collection of Grandpa Classic, and his secret weapon, a chair that had been specially modified to make anyone sitting in it slide forward just enough to be constantly off balance. As Jasmine and Alexander headed outside for the grand tour, Ted rubbed his hands together with the gleeful anticipation of a mad scientist about to unveil his greatest creation. "Operation Dinner Disaster, commence," he muttered to himself, pulling on his lucky pranking apron, the one with "World's Greatest Grandpa" embroidered on the front, and a suspicious collection of stains that told stories better left untold. An hour later, the dining room had been transformed into what looked like a perfectly normal family dinner setup. The table was set with their best dishes, only slightly chipped, fresh flowers from Jasmine's garden, and candles that gave the whole room a warm, welcoming glow. It was the picture of rural hospitality, if you ignored the fact that Ted had spent the afternoon turning it into a minefield of carefully orchestrated chaos. "This looks lovely, Grandpa," Jasmine said as she and Alexander returned from their walk, both of them slightly dusty but smiling. "Very fancy for you." "Well, hell's bells. Can't an old man put on a nice dinner for his granddaughter and her friend?" Ted's pause before the word friend was loaded with enough subtext to power a small town. Alexander, who had learned to be suspicious of anything Ted did that seemed too helpful, eyed the dining room with the wariness of someone who'd spent 2 weeks being the target of increasingly elaborate pranks. "It smells incredible, Mr. Martinez," he said carefully, noting that Ted was wearing what appeared to be his Sunday best, if his Sunday best included cowboy boots that looked older than disco and a bolo tie featuring a tiny plastic armadillo. "Course it does. Made my famous pot roast with all the fixings. Secret family recipe passed down through 3 generations of Martinez men." Ted beamed with pride. "Y'all sit down and make yourselves comfortable while I bring out the food." What Ted neglected to mention was that his secret family recipe for that evening included a generous helping of the hottest peppers he could find in 3 counties, strategically hidden throughout the meal, like spicy landmines waiting to explode. Alexander, being a gentleman despite his recent education in farm-based humiliation, pulled out Jasmine's chair for her. The chair, which Ted had carefully selected for its tendency to wobble at exactly the wrong moment, immediately proved its worth by tilting backward just as Jasmine sat down. "Whoa!" Alexander caught both Jasmine and the chair before disaster could strike, his quick reflexes earning him a surprised smile from her and a grudging nod of approval from Ted, who was watching from the kitchen doorway. "Thanks," Jasmine said, steadying herself. "This chair's been wonky for years. We keep meaning to fix it." "Like the porch steps?" Alexander asked with a grin that suggested he was starting to see a pattern. "Exactly like the porch steps," she laughed. Ted returned to the kitchen, muttering under his breath. The boy had good instincts. This was going to require escalating to more advanced tactics. When Ted emerged with the first course, an innocent-looking salad that definitely hadn't been treated with his special extra spicy dressing, he was pleased to see that Alexander had chosen to sit in the specially prepared chair. The chair that would, with just the right amount of movement, activate the whoopee cushion Ted had carefully secured underneath the seat cushion. "Here we go," Ted announced cheerfully, setting down the salad bowls with theatrical flourish. "Fresh greens from our own garden, with my grandmother's special vinaigrette." Alexander took a bite of salad and immediately reached for his water glass, his eyes widening as the hidden jalapeno juice hit his taste buds like a freight train carrying fire. "It's very flavorful," he managed, his voice slightly higher than usual. "Grandpa!" Jasmine scolded, taking her own bite and immediately understanding what had happened. "What did you put in this dressing?" "Just a little extra kick," Ted replied innocently. "Thought our guest might enjoy something with some personality." Alexander, determined not to show weakness in the face of agricultural warfare, continued eating the salad despite the fact that his face was now approximately the same color as their prize-winning tomatoes. "It's delicious," he insisted, though the beads of sweat on his forehead suggested otherwise. "Very authentic." As Alexander shifted in his seat to reach for more water, Ted's carefully positioned whoopee cushion finally fulfilled its destiny, producing a sound that would have made a foghorn jealous. The silence that followed was so complete that they could hear Napoleon clucking disapprovingly from the chicken coop outside. Alexander's face, already red from the pepper assault, somehow managed to achieve an even deeper shade of crimson. That wasn't, Ted's poker face was absolutely perfect. "Excuse you, son. Maybe ease up on them beans at lunch next time." "I didn't eat any beans," Alexander protested, then realized he was arguing about flatulence with a 75-year-old man in front of the woman he was supposedly courting. That is to say, Jasmine, who had grown up with Grandpa Ted's arsenal of practical jokes, immediately recognized the telltale sound of one of his classic pranks. "Grandpa," she said warningly, "what did you do?" "Do? I didn't do nothing. Just served a nice salad to our guest." Ted's expression of innocent confusion would have won him an Academy Award. Alexander, meanwhile, had reached the point in his evening where he was beginning to suspect that staying for dinner might have been a tactical error. When he shifted again to try to figure out what was making the noise, the chair's special modification kicked in, causing him to slide forward just enough to knock his water glass directly into his lap. "Son of a biscuit," Alexander yelped, jumping up and causing the whoopee cushion to produce an encore performance that sounded like a dying balloon. "Oh my!" Ted exclaimed, rushing over with a dish towel. "These old chairs can be tricky. Here, let me help you with that." As Ted dabbed at Alexander's soaked pants with the towel, which had been strategically treated with just enough starch to make it scratchy and uncomfortable, he couldn't help but notice that the billionaire was starting to look like a man who was seriously reconsidering his life choices. "You know what?" Alexander said, accepting the towel and continuing the futile effort to dry his designer jeans. "I think I'm starting to understand why you're so protective of Jasmine." Ted paused mid-dab. "Come again? You're testing me, aren't you?" Alexander looked directly at Ted with something that might have been respect. "All of this, the bucket, the sprinklers, the electric fence, and now dinner from hell. You're seeing if I'll stick around when things get tough." Jasmine looked between her grandfather and Alexander with dawning understanding. "Grandpa, is that true?" Ted straightened up slowly, his expression shifting from mischievous to something more serious. "Might be. And why would you do that?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious rather than angry. "Because," Ted said, settling back into his chair with the weight of a man carrying decades of wisdom, "any fool with money can buy fancy things and make pretty promises. But life ain't always fancy, son. It's messy and unpredictable, and sometimes it dumps a bucket of pig manure on your head when you least expect it." Alexander nodded slowly. "And you want to know if I'll stick around for the messy parts?" "Damn straight I do," Ted confirmed. "My granddaughter deserves a man who'll love her even when she's having the worst day of her life, not just when she's all dolled up for some fancy party." Alexander looked at Jasmine, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And what if I told you that the worst part of every day this week wasn't the pranks or the humiliation? What if I told you it was driving away from here every evening, knowing I had to wait until tomorrow to see her smile again?" The dining room fell so quiet that they could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, counting off seconds that suddenly felt monumentally important. Jasmine felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her grandfather's spicy salad dressing. "Alexander, I know this whole situation is crazy," Alexander continued, his voice more earnest than she'd ever heard it. "I know arranged marriages went out of style about the same time as corsets and top hats. But somewhere between getting covered in farm-fresh fertilizer and learning to identify which fence posts are electrified, I realized something." "What's that?" Jasmine asked softly. "I realized that I don't want to marry you because of some business arrangement or family obligation." Alexander's eyes never left hers. "I want to marry you because when you laugh at your grandfather's terrible jokes, it's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. I want to marry you because you make biscuits at 5 in the morning and hum while you work. I want to marry you because you're kind to roosters with attitude problems and patient with billionaires who don't know the first thing about real life. Ted had gone very still in his chair, his weathered hands clasped in front of him as he studied the young man who had just managed to surprise him for the first time in decades. "And if you'll have me," Alexander finished, "I'd like to earn the right to be part of this crazy, wonderful family, pig manure and all." The silence stretched for what felt like hours before Ted finally spoke. "Well, I'll be dipped in honey and rolled in feathers," he said slowly. "That was either the most honest thing I've heard in years, or you're one hell of a good liar." "Grandpa," Jasmine protested. "What? It's a legitimate question." Ted held up his hands defensively. "Man shows up here with more money than sense, gets covered in half the barnyard, and keeps coming back for more. Either he's genuine, or he's crazy, or he's both." Alexander couldn't help but laugh. "I'm definitely both." Ted studied him for another long moment, then reached under his seat cushion and pulled out the whoopee cushion with the flourish of a magician revealing his trick. "Son," he said, tossing the rubber device onto the table like evidence in a trial, "I've been pulling pranks since before you were born, and I can usually tell when someone's putting on an act. But you," he shook his head with something that might have been admiration, "you're either the most dedicated actor I've ever met, or you're actually falling for my granddaughter." "It's definitely the second one," Alexander said without hesitation. Ted nodded slowly, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small remote control. "In that case, you might want to know that your chair isn't actually broken. I rigged it this morning." He pressed a button, and Alexander's chair immediately stopped its annoying sliding behavior. "You've been pranking me this entire time," Alexander said, though he didn't sound angry about it. "Every single day," Ted confirmed cheerfully. "Though I gotta say, you took it better than most. Last fellow who tried to court Jasmine ran off after I introduced him to our pet snake." "We don't have a pet snake," Jasmine pointed out. "Course we don't, but he didn't know that." Ted grinned. Alexander looked around the dining room with new eyes, suddenly seeing all the carefully orchestrated chaos for what it was. So the loose floorboards, the wonky porch steps, the bucket of fertilizer, all me, Ted admitted proudly. "Though I gotta say, that rooster attack was pure Napoleon being Napoleon. Can't take credit for that one. And the electric fence? Okay, that one was actually broken and needed fixing anyway. But I might have forgotten to mention it was hot when you offered to help." Jasmine stared at her grandfather in amazement. "Grandpa, you've been torturing this poor man for 2 weeks." "Torturing?" Ted looked genuinely offended. "Honey child, I prefer to think of it as intensive character evaluation, and I'm pleased to report that he passed with flying colors." Alexander stood up, walked around the table, and extended his hand to Ted. "Mr. Martinez, I'd like to formally ask for your granddaughter's hand in marriage, not because of any business arrangement or family pressure, but because I've fallen completely and hopelessly in love with her." Ted looked at the offered hand, then at Alexander's earnest face, then at Jasmine, who was watching the whole exchange with tears in her eyes. "Well, hell's bells," Ted said finally, standing up and shaking Alexander's hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Welcome to the family, son. But I'm keeping that whoopee cushion, just in case you ever get too big for your britches." And as Jasmine launched herself into Alexander's arms with a laugh that was part joy and part relief, Ted settled back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man whose work was finally done. Well, mostly done. He was definitely keeping that whoopee cushion. 6 months later, the Martinez farm looked like something out of a fairy tale. If fairy tales included pickup trucks parked next to Bentleys, and guests who ranged from billionaire business moguls to Mrs. Henderson, from down the road who'd brought her famous 7-layer dip in a casserole dish older than disco. Jasmine stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her grandmother's pearl necklace and trying not to cry enough to ruin the makeup that Alexander's assistant Miranda had insisted on hiring a professional to apply. The wedding dress, a perfect compromise between Alexander's desire for designer elegance and her own need for something she could actually move in, made her feel like a princess who could still milk a cow if necessary. "You look beautiful, sweet pea," Robert said from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. Over the past 6 months, watching Alexander integrate himself into their family with the determination of someone learning a completely foreign language, Robert had gone from worried father to grateful father to downright proud father-in-law. "Thanks, Dad." Jasmine turned to face him, noting that he'd managed to get through tying his tie without Ted's helpful interference. "Is everything ready outside?" "Define ready," Robert chuckled. Your grandfather spent this morning setting up what he calls wedding security measures around the altar. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but Miranda looked like she was about to have a nervous breakdown when she saw him stringing up fishing line around the flower arrangements. Jasmine laughed, despite her nerves. Please tell me he's not planning to prank Alexander at our actual wedding. Oh no, nothing like that, Robert assured her, then paused. Although he did mention something about making sure any party crashers would get a proper Martinez family welcome. Apparently, some fancy reporters have been trying to sneak onto the property all morning. Through her bedroom window, Jasmine could see the organized chaos that had become her wedding day. The front yard had been transformed into an outdoor chapel that somehow perfectly blended Alexander's expensive taste with their farm's natural charm. White silk drapes hung from the old oak trees. Professional lighting equipment disguised as rustic lanterns created the perfect ambience, and enough flowers to supply a small parade had been arranged to look like they'd grown naturally around the makeshift altar. The guest list was an entertaining mix of Alexander's business associates, who kept checking their phones and looking mildly terrified of Napoleon, who was strutting around in a tiny bow tie that Ted had insisted was formal rooster attire, and their local friends and family, who were treating the whole event like the best entertainment they'd seen since the county fair. "Jasmine," Ted's voice boomed from downstairs. "You decent? Your husband-to-be wants to have a word before the ceremony. Grandpa, he can't see me before the wedding. It's bad luck. Honey child. After everything that boy's been through with this family, I don't think a little thing like wedding superstitions is gonna scare him off." Jasmine heard the sound of expensive Italian leather shoes on their creaky stairs, followed by Alexander's voice. "I promise I'll keep my eyes closed." "You better, or I'll introduce you to my shotgun collection," Ted called out cheerfully. Alexander appeared in the doorway with his eyes squeezed shut like a kid playing the world's most expensive game of hide-and-seek. He looked absolutely perfect in his custom tuxedo, except for the small piece of hay stuck in his hair that suggested he'd been helping with last-minute setup, despite Ted's protest that city boys shouldn't be doing farm work in fancy clothes. "Can I open my eyes yet?" he asked. "No, but you can talk," Jasmine replied, fighting the urge to reach over and fix his hair. "I just wanted to give you something before we make this official," Alexander said, pulling a small wrapped box from his jacket pocket. "Your grandfather helped me pick it out." "Grandpa helped you shop for wedding jewelry?" He had very strong opinions about what was appropriate for a Martinez family bride, Alexander said with a laugh. "Apparently diamonds are fine, but they better come with some substance to them, not those tiny little chips that wouldn't impress a magpie." Jasmine accepted the box, her fingers brushing against his in a way that made her heart skip like a stone across water. Inside was a pair of earrings that made her gasp, gorgeous pearl and diamond pieces that were clearly expensive but had a vintage charm that suggested they'd been chosen with love rather than just money. "Alexander, they're beautiful. They belong to my grandmother," he said softly. "She would have loved you. Probably would have helped your grandfather with his pranks, actually. She once convinced my very serious grandfather to dress up like Santa Claus and deliver presents to the entire neighborhood on horseback. I can't wear your grandmother's earrings. What if I lose them? Then we'll buy new ones," Alexander said simply. "They're just things, Jasmine. You're what matters." From downstairs came the sound of Ted's voice booming over what appeared to be a small crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, if y'all could take your seats, we're about to get this shindig started. And remember, anyone who tries to take unauthorized photos is going to get personally acquainted with my prize-winning bull." "I should probably go," Alexander said. "Your grandfather made me promise to be at that altar in 5 minutes, or he'd come looking for me with what he called his special wedding day persuasion tools." "Go," Jasmine laughed. "I'll be down in a few minutes." As Alexander's footsteps retreated down the stairs, Jasmine put on the earrings and took one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized, not because of the dress or the makeup or the fancy jewelry, but because of the glow of happiness that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. 6 months ago, she'd been facing an arranged marriage to a stranger. Today, she was about to marry the man who'd learned to love everything about her life, from her grandfather's terrible jokes to Napoleon's attitude problem, to the way she hummed while making biscuits at dawn. "You ready, sweet pea?" Robert appeared beside her, offering his arm. "More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life." The ceremony itself was perfect in all the ways that mattered, and hilariously imperfect in all the ways that made it uniquely theirs. Ted, resplendent in his best suit and his lucky cowboy boots, had somehow convinced the minister to include a reading from what he claimed was traditional farm wedding scripture, but sounded suspiciously like something he'd made up on the spot about love being like tending a garden, requiring patience, hard work, and the occasional application of fertilizer. Alexander's best man, his business partner who looked like he'd never been closer to livestock than a polo match, spent the entire ceremony eyeing Napoleon with the wariness of someone who'd been warned about the rooster's opinion of fancy neckwear. Miranda, serving as Jasmine's maid of honor in a role that had surprised everyone including herself, had somehow managed to coordinate the entire event without having a complete nervous breakdown, though she did keep a running list of what she called agricultural complications that had already reached 3 pages. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Ted stood up with a theatrical flourish that made half the guests hold their breath in anticipation. "I got something to say," he announced, his voice carrying across the farmyard with the authority of someone who'd spent decades making himself heard over farm equipment and stubborn livestock. Alexander went slightly pale, probably wondering if this was the moment Ted revealed one final ultimate prank. 6 months ago, Ted continued, I thought this young man was just another city slicker trying to buy his way into our family. I did everything I could think of to run him off, up to and including introducing him to the business end of a manure spreader. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. But you know what this fool did? Ted pointed at Alexander with something that might have been admiration. He kept coming back, day after day, week after week, getting knocked down and getting back up again like some kind of well-dressed punching bag. And somewhere along the way, I realized something important. Ted's voice softened, and for the first time since Jasmine had known him, her grandfather looked almost emotional. I realized that any man stubborn enough to stick around through my worst pranks, patient enough to learn how to fix a fence without electrocuting himself, and brave enough to keep proposing to my granddaughter even after meeting Napoleon, well, that's the kind of man who's gonna love her through anything life throws their way. He raised his hand toward the couple. So I ain't objecting. I'm just saying welcome to the family, son. And congratulations on passing the most thorough character test this side of the Mississippi. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Jasmine felt tears streaming down her face, in a way that was definitely going to ruin her professional makeup job. When Alexander was finally allowed to kiss his bride, he whispered against her lips, Was that the last test? With my grandfather, Jasmine whispered back. Honey, I think the testing period just got extended to the rest of your natural life. Good, Alexander said, and kissed her again. I'd be disappointed with anything less. The reception was everything a farm wedding should be. Loud, joyful, slightly chaotic, and full of the kind of dancing that prioritized enthusiasm over technique. Alexander's business associates gradually loosened up as Ted regaled them with stories that grew more outrageous with each telling, and by sunset, even the most uptight corporate executives were line dancing badly and loving every minute of it. The cake, a 3-tiered masterpiece that had somehow survived being transported to a farm without refrigerated trucks or professional catering equipment, was cut with appropriate ceremony and only minimal pranking from Ted, who'd apparently decided that putting a whoopee cushion under the cake table would be undignified for such a formal occasion. As the evening wound down and guests began to head home, Jasmine found herself sitting on the front porch steps with Alexander, both of them exhausted and perfectly happy. Her dress was slightly wrinkled, his tuxedo jacket had been abandoned hours ago, and they were sharing a piece of Mrs. Henderson's 7-layer dip straight from the casserole dish because all the proper plates had been claimed by departing guests taking home leftovers. So, Alexander said, taking another bite of dip with a plastic spoon that had probably seen better decades. How does it feel to be Mrs. Ashford? Like the luckiest woman alive, Jasmine replied honestly. Though I'm keeping Martinez as my middle name. Family tradition. Wouldn't have it any other way. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the cleanup crew, mostly Ted and Robert arguing about the proper way to fold silk draping, finish putting their farm back to its normal state of organized chaos. Alexander, Jasmine said eventually. Yeah? Thank you. For what? For not giving up, for sticking around through all of Grandpa's crazy tests, for learning to love this place and these people, and this completely insane life we live here, Alexander set down the casserole dish and took her hands in his. Jasmine, 6 months ago I thought I knew what I wanted. Success, money, the perfect business deal, the perfect image, the perfect life according to some magazine's idea of what perfect should look like. He gestured toward the farmhouse where Ted could be seen through the kitchen window, apparently teaching Miranda how to make proper sweet tea while she took notes like it was a graduate-level course. But none of that was actually living. It was just existing in a very expensive way. This, you, your family, this farm, learning that Napoleon has strong opinions about everything, and your grandfather's idea of hospitality includes testing whether potential family members can survive agricultural warfare. This is what living actually feels like. Jasmine leaned against his shoulder, feeling absolutely, completely, perfectly content. Even when Grandpa inevitably tries to prank you again? Especially then, Alexander laughed. I've got some ideas of my own for revenge. Did you know your grandfather is terrified of karaoke machines? Alexander Ashford. Jasmine sat up to stare at him in mock horror. Are you planning to prank my grandfather? I prefer to think of it as embracing family traditions, Alexander said with a grin that would have made Ted proud. Besides, someone's got to keep him on his toes. From inside the house came the sound of Ted's voice, raised in what appeared to be either a victory song or a challenge to anyone brave enough to question his sweet tea methodology. Miranda's voice could be heard responding with the kind of detailed questions that suggested she was either genuinely interested or plotting the most comprehensive revenge in the history of personal assistance. You know what? Jasmine said, standing up and brushing off her dress. I think this is going to be the most interesting marriage in the history of interesting marriages. I'm counting on it, Alexander replied, standing up and offering her his arm with all the gallantry of a man who'd learned that real romance involved a lot more creativity than expensive restaurants and fancy jewelry. As they walked back toward the house, their house now, filled with their family and their friends and their completely wonderful, utterly chaotic, absolutely perfect life, the porch light illuminated a small sign that Ted had apparently hung up while they weren't looking. Martinez Ashford Farm, it read in Ted's distinctive handwriting. Home of the world's most entertaining family. Visitors welcome, pranks included, no charge. And underneath, in smaller letters, Napoleon the Rooster reserves the right to reject anyone wearing fancy ties. Alexander looked at the sign, then at Jasmine, then threw back his head and laughed with the kind of pure joy that suggested he'd finally found exactly where he belonged. Welcome home, Mrs. Martinez Ashford, he said. Welcome home, Mr. Martinez Ashford, she replied. And from somewhere in the distance, Napoleon crowed his approval of the whole arrangement, probably already planning his own contribution to whatever adventures the newest members of the Martinez family would face together. After all, someone had to keep an eye on them, and who better than a rooster with attitude and a grandfather with an unlimited supply of creative mischief? The Martinez farm had seen a lot of changes over the years, but one thing would always remain constant: love, laughter, and the occasional well-placed whoopee cushion, administered with surgical precision by the world's most dedicated grandfather. And they all lived hilariously, chaotically, perfectly ever after. The end.